Elias Vance was a man who lived by the iron laws of silence. Up in the jagged teeth of the Montana high country, silence isn't just a preference, it's a survival strategy. He had a ranch that produced more rocks than cattle, a dog that didn't bark, and a past that he had buried deeper than the frost line. 12 years ago, Elias had stood over a shallow grave in the aftermath of a border skirmish and made a vow. He had laid his pearl-handled Colt on the dirt, turned his back on the life of a regulator, and sworn to the Almighty that he would never again take up a weapon, and he would never again let the world's blood stain his porch. It was a sacred vow, a pact made in the smoke of regret. For over a decade, he'd kept it. He was just a rancher, a man of peace, a man who looked at the ground when he rode into town for salt. But the mountain has a way of testing a man's soul. It started with the wind, a low, morning howl that carried the scent of coming snow. Elias was out near the northern fence line, tightening wire that the winter ice had snapped. That's when he saw the horse. It was a bay, lathered in sweat despite the freezing air. Its eyes rolled back in terror. It wasn't carrying a rider. It was dragging one. A woman's foot was caught in the stirrup. Elias dropped his pliers. The world seemed to slow down, the way it used to during the war. He caught the horse's bridle, calming the beast with a low, rhythmic hum. He knelt in the dirt, and his heart, which he thought had turned to stone years ago, gave a sickening thud. She was barely 20. Her dress was a ruin of silk and lace, a wedding gown turned into a shroud of mud and blood. Her face was pale as the mountain peaks, and her hands, they were bound at the wrist with heavy, rusted wire. She wasn't dead, but she was close enough to see the gates. As Elias reached out to lift her, her eyes flickered open. 2 shards of emerald green, clouded with a pain so deep it made Elias wince. She saw him. She didn't scream. She didn't ask for help. She just gripped the sleeve of his heavy wool coat with fingers that looked like bird claws and whispered 5 words that shattered the quiet Elias had spent 12 years building. "They're coming for the map." Elias carried her back to cabin. He moved with a grim purpose, ignoring the ache in his knees and the ghost of the vow whispering in his ear. He laid her on the long wooden table near the hearth. The cabin smelled of pine needles and old coffee, a bachelor's fortress that had suddenly been breached. He cut the wire from her wrists. He worked with the steady hands of a man who had patched up soldiers in the mud of Virginia. Every time the wire snapped, she flinched, but she never made a sound. That silence, that was what got to him. It was the silence of someone who had learned that screaming only brings more pain. He cleaned her wounds with warm water and a splash of his best rye whiskey. She watched him the whole time. "I'm Elias," he said, his voice rusty from disuse. She didn't answer at first. She just stared at the ceiling, her chest rising and falling in shallow, jagged hitches. Finally, she spoke. "Clara, my name is Clara." "Who did this, Clara?" She turned her head, looking at the heavy oak door Elias had bolted shut. "Men who don't believe in mercy. Men who think they can buy the future if they find what's buried under the old mission." Elias froze. The old mission. It was a ruin 3 miles from his ranch. He'd lived next to it for a decade and never given it a second thought. But he knew the stories. Stories of gold stolen from the Union. Gold that vanished in the mountains during the final days of the war. "I promised I'd never tell," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I promised my father on the day they took him. But they did things, Elias. They wanted the location. They think I have it memorized." Elias looked at her, seeing the welts on her arms, the purple bruises on her neck. He felt a familiar heat rising in his chest. It was the heat of the regulator, the heat he had sworn to extinguish. "You're safe here," Elias said, though he knew it was a lie. "No one is safe," she replied. "The man leading them, he doesn't stop. He wears a black hat and carries a cane with a silver crow on the top." Elias felt the air leave his lungs. Elias Vance, the crow, a man he hadn't seen since the siege of Vicksburg, a man who knew exactly who Elias Vance used to be. "If you're still sitting here by the fire with me, you know that some ghosts refuse to stay buried. You're just like Elias. You know that the hardest thing a man can do isn't picking up a gun. It's try to put it down for good. If the story is stirring something in your soul, do me a favor. Hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. We're building a community of folks who appreciate the grit and the silence of the Old West, and we'd be honored to have you ride along with us. And before we get to the moment Elias has to make his choice, tell me in the comments, where are you listening from today? What time is the sun setting over your horizon? I read every single one, and I appreciate you keeping the story alive. Now, let's get back to that cabin in the snow. The blizzard arrived by nightfall. It was a whiteout, a wall of frost that turned the world into a blur of gray and silver. Elias sat by the window, his unlit pipe in his mouth, watching the edge of the woods. Clara was wrapped in his blankets on the cot by the fire. She was sleeping, but it wasn't a peaceful sleep. She was running in her dreams. The map, she muttered in her sleep. 6 paces from the altar, under the stone with the weeping eye, Elias closed his eyes. He didn't want to hear it, knowing the secret made him part of the game, and he had vowed to stay on the sidelines. Suddenly, the dog, Old Blue, stood up. He didn't bark, but a low rumble started in his throat. Elias stood up, his hand reaching for the empty spot on the wall where his rifle used to hang. He'd sold it 3 years ago to pay for a new plow. He was a man of peace. Then came the sound, over the roar of the wind, a rhythmic thumping. Thump, thump, thump. It wasn't a horse. It was a cane hitting the wooden boards of the porch. Elias walked to the door. He didn't open it. He just stood there, the wood cold against his forehead. I know you're in there, Elias. A voice called out. It was a voice like silk pulled over a blade. I recognized the handiwork on that fence line. Always was a man of precision. Go away, Silas, Elias said, his voice steady. There's nothing for you here but the cold. Now, that's where you're wrong, the voice replied. You got a guest. A girl who took something that belongs to my employers. Hand her over, and I'll forget I found you. I'll let you keep playing farmer. Clara was awake now. She was sitting up, her emerald eyes wide with terror, her breath coming in hitches. She looked at the door, then at Elias. Don't let them, she whispered. Please. Silas Vane laughed. I've got 6 men with me, Elias. They're cold, they're hungry, and they don't have your moral compass. We'll give you until the sun touches the peak to decide. After that, we burn the cabin. Vow or no vow. The sound of the cane faded as Silas walked off the porch. Elias turned back to the room. He looked at Clara. He looked at his hands. The hands of a rancher, calloused from the plow. Then he looked at a loose floorboard near the hearth. He won't leave you alive, Clara said, her voice a hollow ghost. Even if you give me to him. He knows you saw his face. Elias nodded. He knew Silas Vane. Silas didn't leave witnesses. Elias walked to the center of the room. He took a heavy iron key from a chain around his neck. He walked to the door and turned the lock. Click. What are you doing? Clara asked. I'm locking the door, Elias said, and I'm breaking a promise. He went to the hearth and used a crowbar to pry up the loose floorboard. Beneath it sat a long, rectangular box made of dark walnut. It was covered in dust and cobwebs. He lifted it out and set it on the table. Clara watched, her breath held. Elias opened the box. Inside, resting on a bed of red velvet, was the pearl-handled Colt. Beside it was a Winchester Henry rifle, the brass frame gleaming in the firelight. They weren't just weapons. They were the tools a man Elias had tried to kill off 12 years ago. He picked up the Colt. The weight of it felt wrong, and yet it felt like a part of his arm he'd forgotten was there. He checked the cylinder. Full. You swore a vow, Clara whispered. I did, Elias said. He looked at her, his eyes hard as flint. I swore I'd never kill again to satisfy my own pride. I swore I'd never seek out a fight. But I never swore I'd let a monster walk into my home and take what isn't his. He spent the next hour cleaning the Winchester. He worked in silence. The blizzard raged outside, but inside the cabin, the air had grown still. The rancher was gone. The regulator had returned. As the first gray light of dawn touched the frost on the windows, Elias stood up. He put on his heavy coat and tucked the Colt into his belt. Stay under the table. Elias commanded, "Don't come out until the shooting stops." "Elias," she called out. He stopped at the door. "Why? Why for me?" Elias didn't look back. "Because some things are more sacred than a vow, and one of them is the truth." The snow was red by the time the sun fully rose. Silas Vane had expected a rancher to come out with his hands up. He hadn't expected a ghost. Elias had moved through the whiteout like he was part of the wind itself. For shots from the Winchester had found their marks before Silas's men even knew the fight had started. The final confrontation had happened near the old mission. Silas Vane, his black hat lost in the snow, leaning on his silver crow cane, looking into the barrel of a pearl-handled Colt. "You broke it," Silas had hissed, blood staining his teeth. "You broke your precious vow." "No," Elias had replied, his voice a whisper. "I just fulfilled it. I vowed to protect the innocent. I just forgot that sometimes protection requires a price." Elias returned to the cabin an hour later. He was leaning on the Winchester, his shoulder bleeding, but his eyes were clear. He walked inside, locked the door behind him one last time, and sat down at the table. Clara came out from her hiding spot. She didn't ask if it was over. She could see it in the way the shadows had settled in the corners of his eyes. She sat across from him and reached out, placing her small, scarred hand over his calloused one. "It's gone," she said. "The map, I burned it in the hearth while you were out there. No one will ever—" Elias looked at the fireplace, at the gray ash swirling in the heat. He nodded slowly. The secret was gone. The threat was gone. But the man he had been for 12 years, he was gone, too. In the weeks that followed, the ranch changed. Clara stayed. She helped him mend the fences, and he helped her mend the parts of her soul the world had tried to tear away. They didn't talk about the gold. They didn't talk about the war. They talked about spring, about planting things that would grow. Elias never put the guns back on the floorboards. He kept the Winchester over the mantel, a reminder that peace isn't a gift. It's something you have to be willing to defend. He had broken his most sacred vow. But as he sat on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset turn the Montana peaks to gold, he realized something. A vow that keeps you from doing what's right isn't a vow at all. It's a cage. And for the first time in 12 years, Elias Vance was free. If this story touched your heart, if you believe that some things are worth breaking even the most sacred promises for, give this video a like. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next journey into the heart of the Old West. And as you go about your day, think about this. What would you be willing to break to save a soul? Take a deep breath. Pour yourself another cup of coffee. And remember, out here, the stories never truly end. They just wait for the next sunrise. Safe travels. Friends, we'll see you on the next trail.